life. Australia has a rich history of world-leading researchers in the ancient world, its languages, its literature, its thought, its history, its art, and its culture. The Trendle Lecture, since 1997, has celebrated this long tradition and reminds us of the deep and continuing relevance of the ancient world and late antiquity to modern life. Professor A.D. Trendle, Dale Trendle, was a Foundation Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He was an authority on the pottery and vase painting of Greek colonies of South Italy. He was at the ANU during its early years, initially in 1954 as the first Master of University House, and also for 6 years as Deputy Vice-Chancellor. After his retirement in 1969, Trendle moved to La Trobe University, where he held the position of Resident Fellow until his death in 1995. This lecture is made possible by a bequest from Trendle's estate. Given the level of interest in the lecture and the community gathered to hear it, we can say that the goal of his bequest is well and truly being met by keeping the classics alive and relevant through the sharing of contemporary discoveries. Professor Katie Barrett is an archaeologist who investigates everyday life, religious experience, and cross-cultural interactions in the ancient Mediterranean. She is currently co-directing an excavation at Pompeii, the Casa della Regina Carolina project, which is a joint Italian-American project sponsored by 3 universities, the University of Bologna, Cornell, and Harvard. And Katie is working on a new book about the archaeology of ancient Greek household religion. Katie has published extensively on interactions between Egypt and the Greco-Roman world. Her first book, Egyptianizing Figures from Delos, a study in Hellenistic religion, investigates religious change and cultural hybridization in the household through a study of locally made Egyptianizing terracotta figurines. Her second book, Domesticating Empire, Egyptian Landscapes in Pompeian Gardens, is the first contextually oriented monograph on Egyptian imagery from Roman domestic contexts. Most recently, her co-edited volume, Households in Context, Dwelling in Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, is the first synthetic book-length study of houses and households from Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt. Katie is therefore abundantly qualified to speak on the subject of her lecture, and we very much look forward to hearing her speak on household archaeology and the domestication of empire, Egyptian landscapes at Pompeii. Please welcome Katie back.
Well, thank you so much for that really generous introduction. And I also want to extend a really heartfelt thanks to Tatiana and Tom, who have put in so much work to this conference and to taking care of all of us. I also want to thank ASCS, the Australian Academy of the Humanities, Australasian Women in Ancient World Studies, and the Department of Classics here at Australian National University for so kindly inviting me to be here today. And in addition to the acknowledgements of country that we've heard at the start of the conference, I want to acknowledge that I wrote the majority of this talk on the traditional homelands of the Gayogahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayogahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations. And I honor the ongoing connection of Gayogahono people to their lands and waters. thank you all for being here today. I'm very grateful to you for the opportunity to share company with James and Dennis as invited speakers, and I've been inspired by all the exciting work being shared at this conference. So I'm coming from a long way away myself, so I thought it would be appropriate for my contribution here to explore some facets of long-distance connectivity in antiquity, and especially in the Roman Empire, a period that is sometimes described as anticipating modern globalization in various ways. In particular, I'll be talking about the historical entanglements of Egypt with the Greco-Roman world, and I'll use the case study of representations of imagined Egyptian landscapes in Roman domestic contexts to explore how those entanglements impacted everyday life at one of the best preserved sites from antiquity, Pompeii. One of the themes that most strongly motivates me in my research is trying to situate individual sites and regions within a broader Mediterranean, Near Eastern, and North African context. So rather than treating ancient societies as belonging in separate boxes with the Greeks in this box and the Romans in this box and the Egyptians in this box, et cetera, I want to explore how these groups were connected in larger networks of people, things, and ideas. So my case study tonight will focus on a particular Roman house at Pompeii, the so-called House of the Ephebe. We'll look at what the finds from this house might have to do with interactions between Egypt and Rome in the 1st century CE. Many of us enjoyed Lily Withycombe's tour of the Pompeii exhibit at the National Museum yesterday. And this house in particular is known for the elaborate paintings of Egyptian or pseudo-Egyptian landscapes that decorated the sides of a dining structure, garden. And here in the slide, you can see a few of the most striking images from these frescoes. There they went. On the left, a temple of the goddess Isis. On the right, a scene of what appears to be public sexual intercourse. And on the bottom, a landscape filled with Egyptian plants and animals, such as lotuses, a crocodile, and ibises. So why would somebody in Pompeii choose these striking and sometimes outrageous fantasies of an imagined Egypt to decorate a dining area in their garden? Fantastical Egyptian landscapes are actually a fairly common theme in Roman domestic art. So I've looked at the paintings from the House of the Ephebe as part of a broader research project on images of this genre. At this point in time, Egypt was a province of the Roman Empire. So Roman visual representations of Egypt are, among other things, primary sources for the iconography and constitution of ancient imperialism. And because these images are most commonly found in private houses, they give us an opportunity to look at how the experience and ideology of empire was embedded in daily life. So I've looked over the past several years at a series of case studies from Pompeii to ask what role these images did play in people's lives. And I find the House of the Ephebe to be a particularly useful case study, in large part because it was excavated in the 20th century, rather than in the earliest years of excavation of archaeology or proto-archaeology at Pompeii. So that means that the other finds from this house are sufficiently well documented that we can put the paintings into a larger context. So instead of studying the images in isolation, we can see how they interacted with a whole assemblage of architecture, but also other wall paintings, statuary, vegetation even. And the contents of the garden seem, in many ways, to transform domestic space into a microcosm of the Roman Empire. So I'll go back to the House of the Ephebe today, revisit some of the conclusions that I reached in earlier work on the site, and I'll talk about some ways that my thinking has continued to develop in the past few years, especially regarding broadening the audience for these images. The Nilotic landscapes are painted on the sides of an outdoor dining installation, specifically a triclinium, that is a structure composed of 3 masonry benches, in this case, designed to allow guests to recline while dining and drinking outdoors. So most of the previous work on this assemblage, including my previous work on it, has focused on the ways that elite diners would have interacted with the images. And I do think that social context, elite dining, was important, essential, in fact, to how many interactions with the images would have taken place. But banqueting and elites don't reflect the full set of social practices and of people with whom this assemblage interacted. So I'll also talk today about how non-elite and enslaved individuals within the household might have interacted with these images. And I'll consider, among other things, the affordances that assemblages such as this would have offered to another possible audience within Roman households, namely children, for whom these representations of an imagined Egypt would have contributed to their early socialization. But first, a little bit of background on the broader context for this project. So in 30 BCE, as we know, Octavian, soon to rebrand himself as Augustus, defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony to conquer Egypt, adding this ancient civilization to the territory of the Roman Empire. But by this time, the history of interaction between Egypt and the broadly defined Greco-Roman world already had a vast time depth. By the time Octavian took power in Rome, the pyramids were already older to him, about 2,500 years old at that point, than he is to us. And the earliest states of the Bronze Age Aegean had taken form in the context of trade and diplomatic connections with older societies in the Near East, including Egypt. So Egypt occupies a complicated place in later Greek and Roman imaginations. It can simultaneously represent an archetypal other, a legendary predecessor, and also, of course, a contemporary reality. And starting before the Roman conquest of Egypt, but especially picking up after it, Egyptian imports and Egyptian-style iconography, material things referring in some way or another to Egypt, became extremely popular with consumers in Roman Italy. And in Pompeii, for example, we find temples and domestic shrines to Egyptian gods, luxury goods imported from Egypt as consumer products, and locally made objects or artworks that imitate Egyptian styles or depict what Romans would have considered to be Egyptian themes. Objects referring to Egypt in one way or another are often classified together by modern scholars as Aegyptiaca, literally Egyptian things. And these have attracted a huge quantity of scholarly research. Many so-called Aegyptiaca in Pompeii specifically, or in the Roman world generally, come from public contexts like temples or baths or outdoor monuments. But quite a few others come from private settings, such as houses. And scholarly interpretations of domestic references to Egypt have historically varied. So some studies have attempted to interpret these objects in religious terms, proposing a connection to the Roman worship of Egyptian gods, such as Isis and her family and associates. Other studies of consumer goods referring to Egypt or coming from Egypt have characterized them in terms of the somewhat ill-defined concept of Roman Egyptomania. But plenty of recent critiques have pointed out that any one-size-fits-all explanation of such a widespread phenomenon is going to risk being reductive and to fail to fully capture the numerous ways that people would have valued imports and emulations in antiquity. So to look at what Egyptian or Egyptian emulating material culture is doing in Roman houses, I think we need to contextualize them within the larger assemblages from which they come. And so to that end, let's talk about the specific kind of imagery that we see at the House of the Ephebe, so-called Nilotic scenes. That is, landscapes that depict the River Nile in an imagined Egyptian setting. And as I've mentioned, this was a pretty widespread theme in Roman art, especially in the 1st century CE. Most of the known examples are frescoes or mosaics, though we do find similar themes in other media, and I've argued elsewhere that some sculptural assemblages should be considered 3D Nilotic scenes. And Nilescapes in Roman art typically identify the Egyptian river as such through its characteristic plants and animals, so lotuses, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, and others. Also frequently present, though not always present, are humans. They appear in about 2/3 of Nilotic scenes from Pompeii. Foundational study of Nilescapes in the 21st century is Miguel John Versluis's book, Aegyptiaca Romana, which catalogs all of the Nilescapes then known in 2002 from the Roman world. And here you can see 2 examples from another house at Pompeii, the so-called House of the Doctor. These are among some of the most famous Nilotic frescoes from the Roman Empire. And as in these examples, when human beings appear in these scenes, they're often engaging in a range of stereotyped behaviors that include fighting with river animals, here, drinking and carousing, music making, boating, back there, religious rituals, not quite as visible in these examples, although this seems to be a shrine-like or temple-like structure, and not infrequently, public sex. So here is another example that you can see right now in the National Museum. Some of us did see this in the tour the other day. This is from the so-called House of the Sculptor. And the people in these scenes often, though not always, have proportions that would be consistent with the medical condition of achondroplastic dwarfism. So, for example, they have proportionally large heads, shorter limbs, and stockier bodies. These features seem to evoke Greek and Roman legends of pygmai or pygmaioi, that is, a mythical group of short-statured people whom Greeks and Romans imagined to live in distant lands, and especially Egypt. Their historical reality was debated in antiquity. Their size was believed to be a heritable trait rather than an individual condition, but Roman artists usually depict pygmai with features resembling achondroplasia. And I'm here using the Latin term pygmaeus over the various English terms available for these figures, either the modern cognate, which was once used to describe some present-day populations, but is today often considered derogatory, or dwarf, which would suggest an individual condition rather than a population-wide feature. There are some Central African populations today that are more short-statured than Mediterranean populations, but it doesn't seem likely that Greeks or Romans ever directly encountered such peoples. So the pygmai of Roman imaginations seem to derive more from legend than any kind of proto-ethnography. Nilotic scenes can be found as early as the Hellenistic period, but they become highly popular in the early empire. They can appear in various types of Roman buildings, including temples, baths, and tombs, but they're most common in domestic contexts, as you can see here, wildly more popular. Within houses, they appear most often in rooms that are associated with otium, or leisure, and also with more limited access, especially gardens and dining rooms. And while we can find these images throughout the Roman world, including Egypt, I'll be focusing on examples from Pompeii. And that's basically because of the exceptional preservation quality of domestic assemblages that we get from Pompeii. So it's possible there to relate these images to the rest of, or at least a substantial portion in some cases, of the rest of the contents of the houses. Now, Pompeii was located close to a major port, Puteoli, where Egyptian grain came into Italy, and Egyptian merchants and sailors would have visited. And people in Pompeii could have also developed their ideas about Egypt through various other means: reading, travel, participation in the worship of Egyptian deities. So there was a prominent Isis shrine in Pompeii, or purchase of imported consumer goods like bronze and terracotta figurines, lamps, amulets, vessels, and textiles, all of which are well attested as Egyptian imports. But at the same time, the image of Egypt that comes out of Pompeian context is very much one shaped by and for audiences in first century Italy. So objects like these raise a lot of questions. Should we understand these phenomena as appreciation, stereotyping, appropriation, hybridization, fetishization, globalization, or all of the above, depending on time, place, and context? So now let's look more closely at our case study. These images come from a larger ensemble, continuous frieze along the sides of the benches of the triclinium that provides some of the most elaborate and most extensive examples of Egyptian landscapes as refracted through Roman perceptions. My goal here is to treat these images not just as two-dimensional in the way that we might encounter them on the pages of a publication or a PowerPoint slide for that matter, but as physical things that were part of three-dimensional assemblages. In fact, they're supposed to be interacted with. You're supposed to recline on top of them. So I want to understand how the practice of living with these landscapes and moving through the spaces that they help to create would have impacted people's daily activities. Now, in recent years, the material dimension of Roman imperialism has attracted a lot of interest and also a lot of debate. There's been a surge of research allied with larger currents of thought that are sometimes characterized as new materialist, or following the scholar Ihab Hassan, post-humanist. And these projects often emphasize the theme of object agency, so the idea that material things affect and shape people's lives. And in Roman archaeology, this often involves asking how things made empire rather than the other way around. So how did the material culture of the empire, from concrete to ceramics, facilitate physically the expansion of Roman imperial power or Roman culture. But this move has also generated a lot of critiques, which question whether we should really be decentering humans within the narratives we tell about the past. Some recent interventions ask whether a non-anthropocentric archaeology is actually desirable or even possible, given that the research papers are still being written by people. ChatGPT hasn't gotten to the publication domination phase yet. And I will say, content note, the next slide is going to have an image of ancient human remains. So the study of imperialism, in particular, inevitably has to orient us towards some of the most profoundly human aspects of the ancient world. And these include the death, suffering, and cultural loss of people who were subjected to state violence, as well as the daily activities, perceptions, and sensations that made up people's lives within this or any other ancient state. So as somebody who works on households and daily life in antiquity, I see domestic archaeology as pretty well positioned to contribute to this conversation. Houses and households are sites that are inherently intensely charged with human emotional significance. We can't understand domestic artifacts unless we situate them within this space of powerful, personal, subjective experience. At the same time, if we want to understand human experiences in the household, it is also relevant to ask how the material conditions of those spaces would have prompted particular sensations, thoughts, or practices. So I found it helpful to use case studies from household archaeology to explore what I've called the domestication of empire, by which I mean how domestic visual culture would have played a role in the development of the practices, ideologies, and lived experience of people in imperial period Roman Italy. And at the House of the Ephebe and elsewhere, I suggest that the material culture of everyday life would have enabled individuals at Pompeii to appropriate the imagery of empire in order to pursue their own individual goals. And so back to the House of the Ephebe. This is a fairly large and wealthy house at Pompeii. It was excavated by Amedeo Maiori in the 1920s, and it's among the largest 25% of Pompeian houses. A bit of explanation for the conventional name we use for it. We call it the House of the Ephebe today, after one of the most famous objects found there, the bronze statue of a young man, conventionally called an ephebe after the Greek term for adolescent boys. So it's a modern nickname for this dwelling, which is also known by the somewhat less mellifluous numerical designation that refers to its location in Pompeii. So here is where we are in the city of Pompeii. And almost half of the house area was dedicated to a richly decorated garden. So here's the house. This whole section here is the garden. It was filled with frescoes, statuary, and water features. More on all of these soon. So as we've seen, the paintings are on the masonry triclinium in the center of the garden. A water channel emerging from an edicular shrine-shaped fountain. Oops. Have to watch for that. Once ran between the benches. So here's Gemma Jansen's reconstruction of the hydraulic system. Water channel running from the fountain to in between the benches. And it would have given a sense of three-dimensional reality to the model Nile that they're depicting. As I've said, the Nilescapes here are among the most detailed and elaborate from Pompeii. The images on the interior faces form a single continuous frieze. The north-facing scenes on the eastern and western benches, i.e. what you see on the top of the slide here, appear to be separate vignettes. And these are the images that would have been most instantly visible to somebody entering the garden, the view you get as you enter the garden from the house. The continuous frieze would have been most visible to reclining diners on the benches. The northernmost face, actually I'll go ahead here, the northern face of the easternmost bench depicts a shrine with a statue of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, with some attributes of Fortuna, the Roman goddess. And there's also a falcon, the animal form of the Egyptian god Horus. You can see the little statuette here. A worshiper is making an offering at an altar, and nearby we can see an obelisk Roman paintings depict obelisks as very thin and pointy. They are pointy, but taperingly pointy. And we see also another small statue inside a shrine. The interior of the bench depicts a complex series of motifs. So we're on a riverbank that's dotted with shrines and other buildings. And a woman is spinning thread beneath a canopy. And I'm using, for some slides here, Maiori's archival photos, because in some cases they preserve more detail than is visible today. Ducks and a hippopotamus swim amongst river plants. A boat with an animal-headed, possibly horse-headed prow sails past. We can see figures moving around the riverbank. One is crossing a bridge over a crocodile. There's a statue of the sacred Apis bull on top of a pedestal. And we can see several figures drinking and sitting, reclining around a stibadium, semicircular bench. And then at the far right, a figure approaches another enshrined statue. The southern bench is divided by a channel which would have let water flow through from the fountain. Now, it's not clear whether the cushions that would have once been placed on top of these benches would have been sturdy enough that someone could recline on this bench, or whether this one would have been effectively unusable. The eastern side depicts another riverbank, or more of the same riverbank, with buildings and shrines. There's another obelisk in the distance. And we can see walking figures traversing the landscape. The western side of the bench is poorly preserved, but we can see traces. It's too bad that this little thing, can I move that? Probably not. Oh, maybe. Yes, I can. Okay, great. We can see traces of a battle between a crocodile and a crouching human figure with a spear and a shield. You can see his face here. This is what he looked like in 2012. On the interface of the western bench, we can see another landscape decked with people, buildings, shrines, and an obelisk. Two women are making an offering at an altar within a sanctuary, while another woman feeds two ibises, which were the sacred bird of Thoth. Beneath a canopy, another group of figures sits around another stibadium with a table near a crocodile, which may or may not be threatening them. It's giving them a look anyway. Farther right, more figures traverse a landscape filled with shrines and monuments. And among other structures, there's another obelisk, as well as another statue within a shrine. Finally, the northern face of the western bench shows a scene of sexual activity and music. There's a couple engaging in intercourse beneath an awning. A woman is playing music on the outlos, and a man is approaching carrying an amphora, while other figures look on. And to the left, a man operates an Archimedes screw, which is a device that moves water from one location to another to irrigate the fields. So the frescoes from this sequence provide examples of practically every motif you can find in Egyptian Nilotic scenes, or rather in Roman Egyptianizing Nilotic scenes. And I'll summarize these motifs fairly quickly in the interest of time. I'd be happy to talk more about all of them afterwards. So the river is in flood, as we can see from the blooming lotuses as an indication of seasonality, as well as the irrigation of the fields. As Romans were well aware, the annual flood of the Nile River was essential for watering the land and making agriculture possible in the arid Egyptian climate. Egyptian flora and fauna include crocodiles, a hippopotamus, ibises, palms, and lotuses. The river landscape is filled with religious activity. That's one of the most prominent features of the paintings, as we can see by all the sanctuaries, shrines, divine statues, and offerings. Conflicts with river animals include the spearman facing the crocodile and the possibly ominous encounter of crocodile and banqueters. And themes of sexual activity, musical performance, and alcohol consumption on the riverbanks are all also prominent. What's more, many of the figures, although not all of them, have the proportions that Roman art often seems to use for indicating pygmae. Some other figures do have what Romans would have understood as more idealized proportions, with longer limbs, taller and slimmer bodies, and smaller heads. But many of the other figures would probably have been understood by ancient viewers as somatically non-normative. So these features present the landscapes and their inhabitants as a spectacle of difference that is simultaneously geographic, bodily, and cultural. And it positions the scenes within a realm of fantasy. At the same time, other aspects of the imagery, such as the depictions of outdoor banqueting, suggest parallels between the imagined scenes and their actual contexts. So the garden setting is constructing relationships between painted and real landscapes. Real flowing water would have formed the context in which diners encountered this imagery, bringing the painted Nile to life. The setting of the triclinium also frames the frescoes as echoes of the real-life garden, as the sex scene and the two outdoor banquet scenes place the revelers beneath a trellis or pergola that closely resembles the originally vine-shaded structure on which they were painted. So the architectural context invites viewers to imagine themselves among the painted protagonists of the scenes as the viewers themselves also drink, dine, and socialize on the banks of their model Nile. Now, there's been a lot of debate about how or whether Roman Nilescapes might relate to earlier Egyptian images or practices. Some scholars have argued that these scenes have very little relationship to Egyptian prototypes and instead reflect derogatory Roman stereotypes about Egyptians supposedly being decadent. And the rationale here is that the people in these scenes are often engaging in behavior that Romans would have considered inappropriate, like the public sex, and they often have bodies that Romans would have understood as physically non-normative. At the same time, there are also actual parallels in earlier Egyptian visual culture, dating from the Pharaonic and Ptolemaic periods, for a lot of the characteristic motifs of Nilotic scenes. The yearly flooding of the Nile was celebrated in Egypt with festivals in which sexual imagery and alcohol consumption played a ritual role, celebrating the fertility and abundance that came along with the floodwaters. Some other aspects of the iconography do also evoke Egyptian religious practice and imagery. In Egyptian art, battles with river animals represent the conflict of order and chaos, and people who in fact had achondroplastic dwarfism often played highly valued roles as temple attendants and ritual performers. And here's an amulet depicting a deity with achondroplastic proportions standing on top of two crocodiles. The faience medium and the stylistic qualities of this object come from Egyptian production tradition, not those of Roman art. But the depiction of a figure who appears to have dwarfism standing on top of crocodiles does actually provide a fairly close parallel to some of the depictions in Nilescapes from the Roman world. And some of the earliest Nilotic mosaics come from Ptolemaic Egypt rather than from Roman Italy. So rather than creating the iconography completely from scratch, Roman artists do appear to some extent to have been repurposing types of imagery that were employed in Egypt itself, but that certainly shouldn't make us assume that their meanings must have remained static. In other words, I think we can understand these images as testifying to practices of appropriation that are pretty similar to those that Romans also employed with other peoples. Instead of an either-or choice between Egyptian prototypes and Roman stereotypes, I think we're looking at both. Roman artists would have been emulating motifs that did often originate in Egyptian contexts, but they're also adapting those elements to new styles and settings, and they're reinterpreting them according to Roman desires and assumptions. And ultimately, those appropriations would have functioned, among other things, to naturalize and maintain relationships of political and social power. Moving from the macro scale to the micro scale, given that these often come from domestic contexts, what would they have been doing for the individual people who lived with them? And the vast majority of Nilotic scenes from Pompeian houses, 83% either come from gardens or they come from dining rooms that open onto gardens. A lot of recent research on Roman art stresses the importance of contextual appropriateness, decor. That is, images were supposed to be in some way appropriate to their context. So how is Nilotic imagery appropriate to gardens? Well, for one thing, in Roman houses, gardens are supposed to be places of otium, of cultured relaxation. And by evoking Egypt, a place that Romans culturally and stereotypically associated with luxury and easy living, Nilotic scenes could have helped create an ambiance for relaxation. there are also, as we've seen, some more specific parallels between the images and their settings, which both confront the viewer with lush environments filled with water and vegetation. Almost all the gardens with Nilotic scenes at Pompeii also have visible water features, which run in scale from modest cisterns and gutters to large, elaborate fountains or miniature canals, like here. In a dry Mediterranean environment where water is a limited resource, displaying water in such a way would have been, among other things, an effective way to show off wealth. And representations of the Nile, one of the most famous water sources in the ancient world, would have helped reinforce visitors' perception of these gardens as lush environments, especially in those cases with model Niles constituted by real-life canals. But we can also go beyond this general observation to look at activities that took place in gardens. If we set aside some of the more exoticizing indications of setting, these are essentially depictions of people banqueting outdoors by the water, listening to music, carousing, and performing religious rituals. And all of those were also common activities in real-life Roman gardens. So the painted landscapes and their real-world settings seem to be distorted mirrors of each other, potentially even commentaries on each other. One of the most common activities depicted in Nilotic landscapes is outdoor banqueting. And in Pompeii, gardens were often, among other things, dining spaces. We've got lots of ancient literary references to dining outdoors in good weather. Some gardens contain permanent facilities for dining, like the masonry triclinium here. Yeah. I guess it doesn't go backwards the same way. There we go. But permanent built structures aren't necessary for garden dining because most furniture was portable. In some gardens, excavators have found faunal remains, animal bones, from meals that actually took place there. And dining rooms were frequently located next to gardens, opening onto them so that the diners could view the greenery. What's more, Roman dinner parties often involved mealtime entertainment, which might include music, dancing, dramatic performances, literary readings, or much else besides. So when the scenes depict characters reclining, drinking, and listening to music, they're presenting their viewers with a scene that's not just distant, but in some ways also very close at hand. The foreign setting and the frequent representation of the characters as physically non-normative are distancing and othering, but the activities they're performing are in many ways familiar. So they're mirroring what their viewers might be doing at the same time that they're being distanced from those viewers. And as for the more salacious goings-on, Roman art and literature are full of evidence that people perceived banquets as potentially full of sexual tension and intrigue. Latin love poems speak of flirtation, jealousy, and secret signals between lovers at banquets. And a number of non-Egyptianizing domestic wall paintings like these here depict men and women flirting or kissing over dinner. That said, any actual sex was supposed to happen in private, not out in the open. So the outdoor sex in Nilescapes probably is supposed to strike Roman viewers as comical, excessive, and inappropriate. At the same time, it represents figures acting on impulses that the banqueters themselves would have expected at least potentially to experience. So these images might be making fun, not just of Egyptians or quasi-mythical pygmai, but also at the viewer's own attempts to present themselves as refined, self-controlled diners. And so if we put this all together, Nilotic scenes at Pompeii have really strong contextual associations with water, gardens, and dining. Almost all of them are associated with either gardens, dining, or water features, and about half have associations with all three. So the contexts are creating parallels between two-dimensional landscapes and three-dimensional settings, challenging viewers to consider how they might relate to these figures and these environments, and playfully provoking them to consider their own social performances. What type of social identity would the visitor choose to project in response to the invitations and provocations of the setting? And the specific implications could potentially vary quite a lot, depending on viewer choice. Are viewers supposed to identify with the carnivalesque exuberance of the pygmai? Or are they supposed to treat them as negative examples? This is what not to do at a dinner party. To some degree, it may be up to the diners themselves because their own behavior then becomes their response to, their commentary on the imagery. And even as the Egyptian landscapes introduce a seemingly exotic element into domestic space, other aspects of the garden settings of many of these houses familiarize and domesticate these images at the same time. In the House of the Ephebe, Egyptian landscapes were juxtaposed with images of, among other things, Roman deities, Mars and Venus, who are depicted on a water tower in the corner of the garden, the god Pan and satyrs depicted as marble statuettes, and a fountain sculpture depicting a goddess or nymph from whom the waters actually flowed. There was also a poorly preserved stucco embellishment on the fountain, which depicted the goddess Diana. And some of these figures had specifically local resonance as well, in that at this point, Venus was the patron deity of Pompeii. Behind the fountain was a fresco depicting a game park, evocative of the estates of Hellenistic rulers. And reinforcing that theme, other statuettes from the garden depicted wild animals associated with hunting. Other garden statuary recalls Greek art of different periods, from the archaizing head in the center of the shrine, the center of slide, rather. Oh, the world's a shrine. It was originally attached to a herm, and the classicizing bronze ephebe that gives the house its name. And finally, the canal that flowed between the painted riverbanks. The model Nile itself originally served to water what's been archaeologically identified as a planted vegetable garden. So it would have contributed productively and quite concretely to the real-life household economy. So in other words, the images of Egypt don't appear in isolation. They're rubbing shoulders with material culture that also creates associations with Greek and Italic art, gods, landscapes, cultural practices, and creates a complicated mixture of trans-Mediterranean and temporal references. And some features of that imagery reinforce the trope of Egypt as a distant and exotic place. Other aspects of the garden literally domesticate this unusual set of images. The owners of this house could trace their own personal Nile to a fountain and water tank guarded by Venus, the protective divinity of their own home city. So we're faced with an image of Egypt that's simultaneously foreign and familiar. It occupies an uneasy borderland between self and other, rather than falling fully on one side or the other. On a social level, assemblages like this one could have enabled individuals to present themselves in ways that their contemporaries could have understood as sophisticated or cosmopolitan, by showing off their knowledge of those ancient Mediterranean societies, Greek, but also Egyptian, that Romans associated with intellectual and cultural prestige. At the same time, given that both Greeks and Egyptians were now part of the Roman Empire, these domestic assemblages would have given Pompeians a way not just to think about, but also participate in the ongoing creation and maintenance of empire. So the house becomes a miniature version of the Roman world, or at least the eastern half of it, and a workshop where individuals could figure out through practice what it meant to them to be part of this sprawling polity. Going further, framing these images just in terms of interactions between Romans and Egyptians may oversimplify matters, because it risks eliding distinctions between Italy and Rome. Pompeii entered the Roman Empire through conquest, no less than Egypt. Before the social war in the 1st century BCE, Pompeii was governed by a different Italic group whom Roman sources identify with the so-called Samnites, and whose dominant language was Oscan rather than Latin. And evidence suggests that pre-Roman Pompeii was a cosmopolitan society with a multi-ethnic, multicultural population and a long history of international interactions. The Bay of Naples had a huge, extensive history of Greek settlement going back to the 8th century BCE. And also close to Pompeii was the major international port of Puteoli, which drew merchants and travelers from all over much of the Mediterranean. So even before the Roman conquest, this area was already a palimpsest of many different phases of immigration, colonization, and cultural contact. And the material culture of pre-Roman Pompeii suggests active, ongoing ties to people, societies, and practices throughout a lot of the Mediterranean basin. At the time of the eruption, 79 CE, Pompeii had been a Roman colonia, a colony for over 150 years, and Egypt had been a province for over 100 years. Legally, the people of Pompeii were now Roman citizens. But as Andrew Wallace Hadrill has stressed, that doesn't have to mean that local Campanian identities necessarily vanished. So for Pompeians, that local history would have formed part of the background for the ways the Roman world is represented in domestic material culture. And rather than presenting a narrative of straightforward violent domination of provincial groups, a lot of Pompeian and other contemporary Italian domestic art seems to present them to at least some extent as participating in the creation of a shared imperial culture. Now, from today's standpoint, this looks like a cover-up. It's glossing over all the violence, all the inequalities of imperial rule. But if we want to imagine how people at Pompeii would have responded to these depictions, it may be relevant that the people whose relationship to the Roman Empire required negotiation weren't just Egyptians, real or imagined, but also Italians, including the inhabitants of Pompeii itself, and even the inhabitants of Rome. Recent genetic studies, in fact, suggest that at the time of the eruption, the people of Pompeii came from a pretty wide range of ancestral and geographic backgrounds. The acquisition of empire entailed vast social, political, and economic upheavals, and the long-term effects of those changes were still playing out in Italy in the late first century. Politically, the provinces were subject to Rome. Rome was also increasingly dependent on the provinces for its supply and maintenance. So when we find territories of the empire represented in Italian houses, they may not just be self-congratulatory hymns to the would-be glories of imperialism, although they surely are also trying to be that. But they also represent attempts to work through what it meant to live in this changing and increasingly interdependent world. And one way that people seem to be trying to do this is through material culture that evokes an idea of a shared trans-Mediterranean elite culture. Now, houses with Nilotic scenes at Pompeii didn't all belong to people who were wealthy or elite. The house of the ephebe is pretty large, pretty well appointed, but one of the closest parallels to its assemblage, with Nilotic scenes painted directly onto a garden triclinium, comes from a different dwelling that we can understand as sub-elite, let's say, the so-called House of the Jeweler, which was a mixed-use structure. It was probably both a shop and the shopkeeper's residence. So people who came from a range of socioeconomic contexts seem to have shared an interest in imagery that's evoking cultural associations with ideas of elite, or sophistication, or leisure, or luxury. So domestic images of Egyptian landscapes seem to be, among other things, ways that individuals could appropriate and transform imperial ideology for their own purposes. The visual culture of Pompeian houses is giving opportunities to individuals from a range of social strata to try to perform what they understood as the roles of cosmopolitan, sophisticated citizens of empire. And in doing so, they would be performing not just ethnic or legal identities, but also claiming socioeconomic and cultural status, presenting themselves as elite or wealthy or educated or worldly. So the objects and images with which people are sharing their houses come across as not just illustrations to discourses on identity that are really happening in some other sphere, whether that's political or literary. The domestic environment is where we undergo socialization that shapes the rest of our lives. And household material culture forms our daily practices through constant interaction. On one level, the material culture people lived with was enabling and facilitating their goals and choices. It was a tool that people could use for social performance and self-presentation. At the same time, it's also affecting those people because these objects would have been confronting the people who lived with them on a daily basis, attracting their gaze as a matter of routine. Now, I don't think a fresco like these would have been telling people what to think about it, but it is insisting in a certain way on people's attention by demanding engagement with the imagined world it constructed. Now, at the same time, the house owners and their invited guests wouldn't have been the only people who used this garden. And since 2019, one of the ways I've been trying to expand this project involves more sustained exploration of non-elite and sub-elite viewership. And so that's what brought me to looking at the House of the Jeweler, as we've already seen. And even at a wealthy house like the House of the Ephebe, the people present at banquets would have included not just the diners themselves, but also the enslaved workers who attended on them. Probably also present on some occasions were entertainers, as well as gardeners who were typically either enslaved or formerly enslaved. And performing any of those roles could have required people to get close enough to the triclinium to see its paintings. What's more, it seems likely that the people who actually lived in this household, both free and unfree, would have interacted much more frequently with the garden's visual culture and would have known it in far more detail than any occasional visitor. To be sure, banqueting and the reception of guests certainly appears to be one of the most important intended uses of the garden space. But banquets and socializing also would have taken place only at certain times. During the rest of the day, the garden would have been available for other uses. Some of those uses might have involved the recreation or leisure of the house owners. Others would have pertained to labor, the ongoing maintenance required to keep this garden assemblage functioning. The large open area appears to have contained both decorative and horticultural plantings. Maiori's original excavation report notes the presence of furrows in the eastern side of the garden, and the garden archaeologist Wilhelmina Yashimsky has proposed to identify a vegetable garden here, as I've mentioned before. Now, whatever the specific plantings may have been, gardeners would have then had to perform regular work here. In fact, the subject of garden labor is one that my other current project at Pompeii, the Casa della Regina Carolina project, is trying to explore. Other workers within this household probably also performed a lot of domestic tasks in the garden. It's a large, mostly open outdoor space with access to running water. And that makes it a convenient location, not just for socializing, but also for daily activities like food cleaning or preparation. Even if those tasks didn't actively require participation with the triclinium, it would have presented a lot of useful affordances. The benches and the flat shelf that runs along their edges would have been logical places for people to rest any objects that they were carrying or manipulating. And the water channel would have been not just an attractive entertainment feature, but also useful for washing hands, foods, or tools. And when the owner of the house was absent, the enslaved inhabitants might have taken the opportunity to use domestic spaces like this garden for their own purposes. As Sandra Joschel and Lauren Peterson have pointed out, occasions like that would have made it possible to take a moment's respite from other more unpleasant spaces and activities. And if the banqueters at a house like this one might have seen their own activities reflected in the frescoes, so too would the people waiting on them have seen versions of their own activities. In fact, some of the images or objects in this space can themselves be understood as serving and waiting on the diners. So take this set of tray-holding statuettes, as well as the bronze statue whose hands once held functional supports. These are often described as candelabra, but Ruth Bielfeldt has recently proposed they were actually supports for a tray, which could have held a range of things, including, though not limited to, lamps for nocturnal gatherings. Anthropomorphic stands like this one in the form of classicizing or archaizing idealized youths seem to have been pretty widespread in Roman elite contexts. We have at least 10 other archaeological examples, including 3 from Pompeii, and the poet and philosopher Lucretius refers to statues of lamp-holding youths as a standard way for elites to light nocturnal banquets. And in this house, the statue was likely the showpiece of the garden, if indeed it originally stood on the base near the garden triclinium, which seems likely. It would have been one of the first things a visitor saw when coming into this space. Now, for invited guests participating in the banquet, this statue probably would have conveyed a whole range of messages about the wealth, but also the cultivation and education of the host, and this particular means of constructing and displaying knowledge of classicizing art is profoundly entangled with ancient understandings of empire. The transformation of a classicizing statue into a banquet attendant effectively renders the artwork as itself enslaved, a concrete embodiment of Ovid's boast about a defeated Greece surrendering its conquered arts to the Romans, as well as maybe an echo of the international origins of many of the real-life enslaved workers in Roman households. The idealized figure of the nude youth would have also suggested other attractions. Elizabeth Bartman has shown that this figure belongs to the genre of Roman statuary that she calls sexy boys. That is, well, it's sort of self-explanatory. Images of adolescent boys whose beauty was supposed to attract adult male viewers. Another factor affecting viewers' encounters with this statue could have been scale. It's just under life size. The Ephebe statue is about 1.5 meters high. And there's a whole body of archaeological theory on the subject of scale. Most of it deals with extremes of miniaturization or of gigantic scale. But as Stephanie Langen-Hooper has pointed out, the choice to make an image just slightly over or under life size also conveys messages. In this case, the youth is close enough to visitor's size that they can interact with him. I keep doing that, as though he belonged to the same world that they belong to. So he's not like the Pygmai in the Nilotic frescoes, who have a genuinely diminutive scale. At least in the fresco images, the painted figures about this high. So that emphasizes their distance from their viewers. But the Effie really is designed to interact directly with people. He carries equipment to support their banquets. But his slightly diminutive appearance also reinforces the impression of a disempowered role, recalling the convention in Roman art of depicting lower status people as slightly shorter than higher status people. So here's the fresco recently excavated at Pompeii, depicting the meeting of Paris and Helen, and Helen's companion, who is probably to be understood as an enslaved attendant, is a little bit shorter than the two royal figures. More dramatically miniature in scale are the tray-holding statuettes, about 20 centimeters high, of gilded bronze and silver. Their twisted and emaciated forms and their oversized genitals are inspired by Hellenistic period grotesque figures, as they're conventionally called. I have issues with the label grotesque, but that's what they're often called. And these statuettes have often been identified in the past as caricatures of either cake sellers or enslaved domestic workers. But interestingly, the best parallels for their gesture of clutching their throats and their gaunt appearance come from descriptions and depictions of envy personified as an emaciated, self-choking man. So they probably serve, among other things, to ward off the evil eye, the deleterious effects of envy, even though their presence and their precious metals are paradoxically proclaiming to everybody that this is a household that very well might attract envy. So even if the tray-holding statuettes don't necessarily depict enslaved people, though, they still, like the bronze youth, implicitly take on the roles of enslaved people because they're carrying objects for visitors. And as Ruth Bielfeldt has shown, there is literary and artistic evidence suggesting that ancient Romans expected enslaved workers to notice the parallels between themselves and statues like this one. Petronius portrays the fictional freedman Trimalchio, while he was still an enslaved adolescent, explicitly comparing himself to a lamp holder. So here's an excerpt from the famous banquet episode in the Satyricon. Trimalchio is talking about his life. He says he was brought over in slavery to Italy as a young boy, and he compares his body to a nearby lampstand, which Bielfeldt relates to statues like this one. And he uses it as a measure for his own body, even uses it to try to supplement his body, trying to create a mustache with the lamp oil. Now, obviously, the representations of freedmen and enslaved people in this Roman novel, famously, this is satirical, famously, these reflect elite Roman perceptions and not lived realities. But the passage does suggest that elite Romans did perceive a relationship between furniture, like this statue, and the real people whose role it takes on, and they expected that those real people would notice this too. So these sculptures invite us to revisit the figures in the Nilotic scenes too. Are the Pygmai here to serve and entertain elite viewers? In real life, dancers with dwarfism were sometimes exploited as entertainment in Roman banquets. And such spectacles surely would have influenced the way that people perceived such figures. But reading the Pygmai solely as objects of entertainment and spectacle also oversimplifies the composition in which they appear, because in the frescoes, they're depicted not as banquet entertainment, but as banqueters themselves. They're consuming rather than providing entertainment and service. So what opportunities do the paintings provide for the people who had to serve the diners? Once the frescoes existed, they would have been there for everyone in the household to encounter, whether they were the intended audience or not. And the activities expected of Roman waitstaff, such as pouring drinks, serving food, and cleaning people's hands and feet, would have involved close proximity to the triclinium and would have afforded views of the frescoes, vividly juxtaposed with real-life diners right on top of them. So from this perspective, the structural parallels between the real banqueters and the fantastic Nilotic images, and any humor those images might have communicated, could have hit pretty differently. If any of the banqueters overindulged or behaved in ways that could be perceived as foolish, the people in attendance might have enjoyed the opportunity to surreptitiously look down on this behavior. At the same time, they might equally have taken these images and corresponding real-life performances of relaxation and leisure as aspirational and shaping their own fantasies of what the good life might look like. And just as with elite viewers, people could have responded to these images in their own ways, depending on their own backgrounds through their own performances. Also, besides enslaved workers, Other house residents might include children, adolescents, and aged relatives and dependents, among others. And so given the importance of the household as a space of early socialization, I want to conclude with a short excursus on how children might have experienced this space. And of course, like with any other identity category, we have to think about age-related identities intersectionally. A lot of factors would have differentiated children within the same domestic space. Freeborn children of the house owners would have experienced this space in a very different way than any enslaved children in the households. And other variables like gender, abilities, and disabilities, and relative age would have impacted what children in this household could have done too, of course. Now, within Roman houses, children appear to have had access to a wide variety of domestic areas. When the triclinium wasn't in use for adult socializing, it was probably one of the garden features that a younger child would have found most attractive. The benches would have provided opportunities for climbing, jumping, and hiding. The trellis that once covered the columns would have been pleasantly shady, and the artificial canal would have provided a chance to play with running water. And in addition to those children who were fortunate enough to have opportunities to play, any enslaved children probably would have performed many domestic tasks here. During dinner parties, enslaved older children or adolescents might have been required to serve food or drinks or to hold lamps, much like the statue here, which represents an idealized adolescent boy. So there's every reason to imagine that any children who lived in this house of any status probably spent time in this space and would have been among the viewers of the Nilotic landscapes. So what would they have made of it? Well, we probably can't know what any Pompeian child would have individually made of specific Nilotic motifs. But I think we can reflect on the general implication of what it would have been like to grow up surrounded by images of empire. As we've seen, the Egyptian scenes were just one of many manifestations of Roman expansion in this garden, which also had visual references to Greek and Italic imagery, styles, and landscapes. Both at home and beyond, the inhabitants of Roman Pompeii, which itself had been a non-Roman Italic city not that long before, would have seen appropriations and reimaginings of other cultures practically everywhere they looked. So surrounded by Hellenizing, Egyptianizing, Punicizing, and more, children growing up in this environment could have been socialized to accept what Matthew Lohr, Carolyn McDonald, and Danelle Padilla-Peralta have called the empire of plunder as a natural and unquestioned given. This is just the way things are. So ultimately, I think these assemblages were pretty profoundly entangled with human lives by naturalizing empire, embedding it in the rhythms of daily life, and framing its appropriations as a way for individual people to claim personal status. Domestic material culture could have real implications, not just for the people who grew up with it, but also the larger communities in which they went on to play a role as adults. One of the most powerful ways in which practices and social systems can reproduce themselves is through their own mundanity. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Well, this has been an amazing lecture, so absolutely rich. I feel as though I've spent an hour in a garden and that Katie has taken me around. We've looked at the paintings, we've looked at the sculpture, we've talked about the residents of the house who would spend time there, the enslaved people who worked there, and the children who played there. It has been an amazingly intense exposure to a single Roman garden. So thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions, I'm hoping, Tom. So if there are questions now, let's go for it. Here is one here.
If I just speak up, is that all right? Or would that not get...
Here's a microphone. I won't need.
Well, I don't want to waste...
Yeah, here we go.
Thanks very much. That was indeed rich and fascinating. I just wanted to ask briefly about the depictions of architecture in the frescoes. I was struck, I mean, obviously by the way in which the shrine of Isis resembles a Roman household shrine, but I was also struck by the absence of monumental architecture, you know, pyramids. I was hoping for pyramids. Is this ignorance, erasure, lack of interest or simply a lack of appropriateness for a domestic scene? And if so, why are there obelisks and why do they look like the Eiffel Tower?
I wish I knew why they look like the Eiffel Tower, but then I also wish I knew why, and I'm going to go back to one of the first slides here, oh, if I can. I wish I knew why the crocodile at the house of the doctor looks like a Dimetrodon. It really does. And honest to God, there used to be, I don't know if it still exists, a website online where creationists were arguing that the house of the doctor provides evidence for humans coexisting with dinosaurs. Yeah, so the architecture associated with these scenes really is interesting. There's our little crocodile. Roman artists were not very good at drawing crocodiles in some cases. So sometimes ignorance definitely is a factor. Pyramids never show up in any of the Nilotic scenes that I know of from Pompeii, fascinatingly. The architecture depicted in Nilotic scenes really varies, but there are certain consistent themes. So sometimes you will find what looks very much like Greco-Roman architecture. And sometimes you will find, and I don't think I have any examples on these slides, basically sort of straw huts that resemble, what they resemble most of all actually is Egyptian depictions of habitations in the land of Punt. So I think there are sometimes attempts to locate these scenes far south, possibly farther south than what would have been understood to be Aegyptus, the province. Sometimes, however, they seem to be taking place pretty clearly in an Egypt that has experienced the Ptolemaic period and the start of Roman rule, and where the architecture does look recognizable. And I think it's the choice is sometimes meaningful. So sometimes we find versions of Nilotic landscapes that really double down on the othering, sort of grotesquerie, and the House of the Doctor does that. I mean, just look at the gushing blood here. It's really gruesome. And because these frescoes are well preserved, and because they're famous, they're often taken as emblematic of what all Nilotic scenes do. That kind of thing is actually very rare. And at the House of the Ephebe, there's no blood. Nobody's been hurt, even though there's the one guy menacing the crocodile with a spear. And most of what's going on in the House of the Ephebe is scenes of rural cult. What it looks like on many levels is a sacral idyllic landscape. So you have a rural landscape and people are doing religious piety-related things. And I think they're importing not just the architecture, but also the stylistic features for depicting that from Roman art. And now I'm going to go to, I brought some supplementary slides just in case I got a chance to talk about this. Let's see. Okay, so Roman artists could emulate pharaonic styles when they felt like it. And here in the Villa of the Mysteries, you can see they're trying to take on what's sometimes described as a more hieratic style, using the conventions of Egyptian art for the partially frontal, partially profile figures. It's also fantastic in its own way, but they can pharaonize stylistically when they feel like it. They're not doing that in Nilotic scenes. They pretty much never do that in Nilotic scenes. Rather, they use the loose brushwork characteristic of sacral idyllic painting. And it could go on a whole excursus for why I think that is. I think part of it is that while there is an Egyptian tradition of landscape art, it's often in media that don't travel very well, like the walls of temples and tombs, whereas things that do tend to travel pretty well are miniature figurines, many of which provide incredibly close parallels for what the Pygmai are doing, but which often have a more sort of Hellenizing style.
Katie, I thought that was amazing.
Well, thank you so much.
My brain is filled with questions and thoughts. But one of them, a simple one, was that you said, how do these things travel? Were there Egyptian slaves or painters actually, at the site?
Yeah.
Is there any evidence for that?
Okay, great question. So maybe. Definitely there would have been enslaved people from Egypt in households in Rome and Italy. I mean, the literary references to their existence. There's actually, so the recent genetic study that was done on the fragmentary bone remains inside some of the Fiorelli casts at Pompeii. It talked about, in general terms, ways that those individuals' genetic profiles relate to places in the Eastern Mediterranean or populations in the Eastern Mediterranean. One guy might actually be from Egypt or of Egyptian descent. And there is some evidence that Molly Swetnam Burland, among others, has collected for Egyptian expatriates of whatever legal status living in the Bay of Naples. So there probably would have been people from Egypt around. Artists from Egypt, hard to say. We find a few literary references to a guy named Demetrios the Topographos, and there's been a lot of discussion of what topographos means. Is he a landscape painter? Did he, is he like a founding figure for Nilotic landscapes? Who seems to have connections to Egypt, but the evidence for who this Demetrios was and what he actually produced, what was his output, is pretty thin. So it's definitely possible that there could have been Egyptian artists. If so, they seem to be pretty clearly trained in Roman landscape art traditions. But I think what would have traveled a lot is consumer goods, small portable objects. And actually, if I can go back to one of the slides where I talked about Egyptian parallels, I show examples of some such. Oh, actually, farther down there. That's right, because I guess I included them in the supplementary slides too. Let's try to anticipate what people might ask about, and sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I don't. Okay, so here's examples of, these are all figurines from Ptolemaic or Roman Egypt, and they all have pretty similar themes to what you find in Roman Nilotica. Their meanings in Egypt were probably not the same. There's evidence suggesting that they're often connected with the Nile flood festivals. But we know that figurines like this traveled outside of Egypt because, well, the reason I got into studying Nilotica in the first place was because my first book was about terracotta figurines from Delos, so a Greek island, but one that had this huge population of Italian merchants active there, including many who seemed to be from Campanian families, so they're like from this area. And there are imported figurines, many looking kind of similar to this, and there are locally made ones with similar iconography. So basically small portable things, I think, travel across the Mediterranean very easily and readily, and they can be open to misinterpretation, reinterpretation, et cetera. At the same time, there's no reason to think that actual people from Egypt or people who had traveled to Egypt and come back, whether for touristic purposes or military purposes and many other things besides, wouldn't have interacted with images like the ones in the house at the Ephebe. Yeah, thanks.
At this point, I think we're going to call a halt to questions. In a moment, I'm going to ask Anastasia to tell you about the location of our reception. But first of all, I'd really like you to join me in thanking Caitlin